Good evening and welcome to tonight's Research Tuesday presentation on the intriguingly entitled topic, Eating Our Words. Before we begin, I'd like to first acknowledge the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians of the Adelaide Plains and the land on which the University of Adelaide's campuses at North Terrace, Waite and Roseworthy are built. My name's Inga Davis and I'm the Chief Executive of the External Relations Branch here at the University of Adelaide. And I'd like to start by thanking you all for coming along this evening, which is our second to last Research Tuesday of the year. Tonight, we turn our attention to food choice and food labelling. It can be confusing and at times frustrating for us all when it comes to making healthy and ethical decisions at the supermarket. So Professor Wendy Umberger, Foundation Executive Director of the University's Centre for Global Food and Resources, will tonight be discussing what the research is telling us. Professor Umberger is a world-renowned expert in the food and agricultural sector. She was the 2016 to 2017 President of the Australasian Agricultural and Resource Economics Society, and she is a Fellow of the Food Standards Australia and New Zealand. Professor Umberger serves on the Governance Board of the International Crops Research Institute for Semi-Arid Tropics, and she is also on the editorial board of the Applied Economic Perspectives and Policy Journal. Professor Umberger has spoken globally on topics related to her behavioural economics research, which uses innovative methods to understand the drivers and implications of changing consumer and producer behaviour on food systems. She also studies the impact of urbanisation, modern retail transformation and development programs on food consumption patterns, diet quality and longer-run health and livelihood implications across the region, including Australia, Indonesia, Vietnam and Fiji. Professor Umberger holds a Bachelor of Science in Animal Science and a Master of Science in Economics from South Dakota State University, and she holds a PhD in Agricultural Economics from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Following Professor Umberger's presentation tonight, you are all encouraged to please join in the discussion. We will have roving microphones if you'd like to ask Professor Umberger a question. But until then, please join me in welcoming Professor Umberger to the stage. Thank you.
Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out. I have to admit, due to all the road construction on North Terrace, I was worried there'd be nobody here tonight. So it's really nice to see everybody. I know there's a lot on, and so I'm probably one of the only things standing between all of you and dinner, and here it is, a conversation about food. So I'm conscious we'll try to let you out as noted in the program, and because we're starting a little bit late, I may end up cutting a few slides just to stay on time. So for those of you that are Twitter people, I just put up, if you want to tag us, it's at Wendy Umberger, just my full name, or the Center for Global Foods is at U of A GFAR. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I want to do a shameless plug for the center that I have the lucky job of getting to be the director of, the Center for Global Food and Resources. And I think there's a few of the academics in here. Can you guys just raise your hands? Those of you that are from the center, I'll embarrass you. So several people, several of our PhD students. And I think there's some flyers out there. So we're a center that's mostly made up of agricultural economists and agribusiness specialists. So unlike some of the former Research Tuesdays that have been heavily science-oriented, this is more focused on social science and consumer behavior. So I want to do a disclaimer. I'm an agricultural economist. I'm a behavioral economist. In fact, today they just announced the Nobel Prize for economics, and it went to a behavioral economist. So most of us are not scientists, although we have a background in science. So we are focused on the social and business and policy issues. And if you want to check out the website, there's videos about the work that we do, which extends across the food system. I'm going to be talking about consumers, but we also do a lot of work on all the different aspects of the food system. And we have a couple of postgraduate teaching programs that's what the flyers are about. So please check us out. I'm very proud of our center. I also want to thank and acknowledge some of my co-authors and collaborators on the research. Lenka Melik, who's here tonight, Lenka's played a critical role in all of this research. She's a research fellow in our center, and she's actually a dietitian before she came back and did her PhD in consumer behavior with us at the University of Adelaide. So Lenka's here. We'll let her answer any hard questions. Also here is Dr. Dan Gregg. So Dan started here earlier this year, and Dan's been very involved in some of the analysis of the research. So I just want to acknowledge him, as well as other co-authors, Jill Windle and John Rolfe, who are at Central Queensland University, and then some other colleagues who I know aren't here tonight, but they're also University of Adelaide colleagues, although in a different faculty. The work that we do is very much interdisciplinary, so it brings together different disciplines. And Dr. Rachel, our Professor Rachel Ankeny and Dr. Heather Bray, they're co-PIs on the Australian Research Council linkage project that funded a good share of the research that I'll be talking about. So I just wanted to make sure and acknowledge them. An overview of my talk tonight. First of all, I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to changes that probably most of you are aware of, but just to get our minds thinking about food. Changes in food marketing and consumption behavior that I think are a little bit interesting, and kind of reasons as to why we're looking at these issues. Then I'm going to give some insight into why an economist, an agricultural economist who have traditionally focused on things more related to production, why we're studying consumer behavior, why we care about it, and why we've done this research. And then I'll go through some of the results of our research, namely one study that was funded by that ARC linkage project. So Australian food consumption is changing. And the main drivers of that change over probably the last couple of decades have been increasing disposable incomes. So what does that matter? Well, our incomes have gone up, and it means that we have more purchasing power. We have the opportunity to be more picky about the food that we eat. So we also do work in a lot of the less developed countries in the region, and we're seeing this same phenomenon happen in places like Indonesia, Vietnam. It's been happening in China for a long time, where as consumers come up into middle income and high income, they start to get much more choosy about the food that they eat and stop just caring about how it tastes or the nutrition of it. Another big driver that's been in the news a lot this year is globalization. So international trade. We know that there's more and more trade negotiations to try to free up trade between countries. So why is that concerning, or why is that of interest? It's both positive and negative, and potentially can have negative consequences. Well, it means that as consumers, we have access to food from around the country, and the price of that food is coming down. But what it means is, when those products are coming in from other countries, we don't always have as close a connection to those food systems or as much awareness of those food systems. So basically, the distance between the consumer and the farmer is growing over time. And that causes some uncertainty in the market. Not necessarily bad. There's also, because of globalization, because we're getting more concerned, because we're learning more, because of media, we're growing in our concerns about food safety and our concerns about health. And recently, one of the big concerns that we've seen is concerns about adulteration of food, about the authenticity of food, and some of that's related to this globalization issue and imports of food, but we're seeing concerns about that going up. We're also seeing, and these are related trends, but a really big increase in demand for information on certain attributes of food. One being the content of food. So we're now seeing more and more claims about the nutrition, about how the food was produced, so the content in that food. How many calories are in it? What type of wheat or starch is in it? What minerals, what vitamins are in it? How much salt is in it? Where food is produced. So we know that Barnaby Joyce pushed really hard in the last couple of years after the salmonella outbreak in the fruit to get new country of origin labeling put in place in Australia. So because he believed consumers had the right to know where their food was coming from, and the information, the old labeling, wasn't efficient enough. So origin is more, though, than just country of origin. Country of origin is often associated with safety, but there's also increasing concern or interest, value in provenance. So I might want to purchase a food product from the Adelaide Hills or Margaret River or whatever region, but provenance is becoming of interest. And then these things that we call production and process attributes that I'm later going to introduce the term credence attribute. So attributes like organic, free range, certified humane, and grass-fed that we're seeing more and more on our food products. And then finally, I have to mention allergens. I don't know if any of you have food allergies or friends or children or grandchildren with food allergies, but this is probably one of the #1 growing concerns in Australia as around the world, those food allergens and labeling of those allergens. So just a point. It's interesting, demand for organic food in Australia has been growing by about 5% per annum. But if you look at places like China, the demand is around 20% per annum. So it's growing, and we get excited about that growth, but if you compare it to places like China and Indonesia, it's not nearly as big, but we are seeing growth. The other interesting thing, some of you that are more new immigrants into the country like myself might be surprised about how much meat Australians eat. On average, we eat in Australia, these are 2015 figures, 92.5 kilos. So that's actually the weight of my husband right now. We eat that on average per year. So that's average. So some people are eating much more than that. I don't think I eat 92.5 kilos of meat per year, but so if you think average, some more, some much less. But that's declining over time. It's declining slowly, and we're interested in that as economists as to what's driving that. What implications does it have on primary producers in Australia? What's driving that, and what are the implications? So 3%, which is small, over the 5-year period from 2009 to 2014. And this one, there's probably vegetarians in the room. We're seeing an increase in vegetarianism in Australia, or vegetarian-type diets. So some of you might have heard of the term Flexitarian, or the meat-free Monday movement. All of that's having an impact in terms of that average of meat we move, or eat we meet, eat we meet, meat we eat in Australia. But in 2014, roughly 10% of Australians were vegetarian, and that's now expected to be around 15%. And so just to give you some other figures on that, from 2009 to 2013, there's a 20% increase. So it's off a small base, but still a 20% increase is pretty significant in the number of vegetarians in Australia. And from 2012 to 2013, which are the latest numbers we have, it was a 15% increase. Finally, the final trend I want to mention, because we're going to be talking about meat studies tonight, is the types of meat we eat is changing. So it used to be that the Australian diet, the meat portion of it, was predominantly on a per capita basis beef. But we've seen over time that per capita consumption of beef is going down. Per capita consumption of poultry or chicken is going up, as is pork. And I'll show you a figure on that in a minute. And then what our research is really focused on is this increase in differentiated meat products. If I hold these products up, I have some chicken up here, and if I were to walk into an Australian supermarket probably 15 years ago, you would basically see very little information on this packet of chicken. It might not even be packaged. But in the I've lived here almost 12 years. In the 12 years I've lived here, we've seen a big shift in how meat is marketed, with much more differentiation, more branding of meat, everything from using the breed of the animal to brand the meat to putting claims such as organic and free range on the meat. It's getting so complex that the government's even putting on websites information on how to understand food labels. So this is one from the Eat for Health government website that I pulled off, and it's telling you, don't rely on health claims on labels as your guide. Instead, learn a few simple label reading tips to choose healthy foods. So it's trying to teach people, educate people about how to use the labels. Just some other examples. The meat product I held up is actually a good example, but some of the cues that we see on there, I've blocked off the brand, but you can probably figure out what this brand is if you buy chicken meat. But we're seeing production claims. So everything from how the hens, or the chicken, it's not necessarily a hen, the chicken that produced the broiler, that produced this meat, how they were cared for, that they had access to high quality feed and access to outdoors. That's on the far left-hand side. And also there's other production claims that say that the chicken is free from added hormones and growth promotants. And now we're seeing more and more certifications. So in this case, the certification was to say that it was accredited free range. So that's a certification where there's a third party involved versus a production claim. This is back of the package information. This is something that really surprises me. This was on a meat package that I got at Woolies. But if you look at most meat, there's not much on the back of the package. But in beef, we're starting to see even information turn up on the back of the package. So this is one where clearly they couldn't fit the information they wanted to convey to the consumer on the front, so they're putting it on the back. This is saying certified pasture-fed, that it was raised according to animal welfare practices that were part of a certified system, and that it's certified by Meat Standards Australia, and that it's graded. So just a graph showing you trends. The red line there is what's happened to beef consumption per capita from 1962 up into the estimated figure for 2014 to 2015. And on all of these, I can provide you with the source. This is actually from a Conversation article, but it's ABARES, the Australian Bureau of Agricultural and Resource Statistics, basically, is where the figures are coming from. So you can see by looking at that there's a big peak out here in the 70s. Actually, this was the year it peaked, the year I was born. So I'll give away my age. I was born in 74. But in my lifetime in Australia, you can watch that consumption per capita of beef come down. And this was surprising to me because we always think of Australia as being such a big beef-eating country, but actually in about 2006, 2007, we saw a shift over where now that gap between per capita consumption of chicken and beef is widening quite significantly. So per capita consumption of chicken is really going up. And the other one that really surprised me is pork. Pork, as of 14-15 estimates, has now surpassed on a per capita consumption basis beef. So why is that? Some people would get up here and use these and tell you that's because people think that beef production is bad for the environment because there's been a lot of that in the media and people are getting smart and changing behavior. I think it's that way, and we'll look at that. So why might it be changing? I'll show you some of the results from our research. And then this is just some examples that Link actually put together of things we've seen, the meat-free week, the marketing around trying to promote people eating less meat, maybe not stopping meat, but for example, Paul, Mary, and Stella McCartney say, try skipping meat for 1 day a week to reduce your carbon footprint and improve your health. So we did a little study middle of last year. It was more of a scoping study, and we did an online survey, and we tried to get a sample of vegetarians and a sample of meat eaters that we just randomly obtained from using a panel provider. And we asked meat avoiders, what's your reason for not eating meat? And out of those meat avoiders, or vegetarians, which there were only 82 in our sample, but it was actually the percentage in terms of our whole sample matches up really nicely to that 10 to 15% that we estimate there to be in Australia. And the largest share of the vegetarians said their main reason for not eating meat was animal welfare concerns. That's not surprising, but that's followed. There's quite a big gap. The next largest segment was 38% and 37% saying they do so because of health and environmental protection reasons. So big reasons, concerns about the environment as well as animal welfare, but also health. So then we asked the meat eaters, and there's a lot more to the survey, but just for time's sake, I'm only going to show you a few slides. We asked the meat eaters, have you made a recent change to meat consumption frequency? And they had different options. They could say no change, that they reduced or they increased. And actually, the green color is reduction. So you can see the top row is beef, the next one is chicken, pork, and lamb. So the biggest share of consumers were reducing beef consumption. But does anyone know what was unique about beef last year? It's a price issue. I'll just give it away. Beef was really expensive last year, as was lamb. So very expensive. Chicken, the largest share of chicken eaters, actually increased consumption. So what our data would show is probably some of that is a substitution effect. So 30% of beef eaters did say they reduced it, but we thought we'd find out, okay, why are they saying they're reducing it? Because we're wanting to try to do some prediction in trends. And this was to give industry some insight. Price, blue is lamb, red is beef again, And so nearly 60% of those who said they decreased their consumption did so with beef because of price reasons, and nearly 80% of the people who reduced their consumption of lamb said they did so because of price. However, health is also a reason where about 30% were reducing consumption because of health concerns. So slightly less for chicken and only about 15% of those for lamb. Another reason is animal welfare and environmental protection. But interestingly, if we look at these bars, out of the different types of meat reduction, basically we see the largest share of people that are chicken eaters reducing it. So roughly 25% of the chicken eaters said they reduced consumption because of animal welfare or environmental protection. That's slightly interesting. So I would have thought maybe because of all the stuff in the media about climate change that it would have been higher for beef, but it's actually higher for chicken. So I'm going to get into the results of quite a substantial study we did. And this is the one where Lenka and Dan, this is a quantitative study that we did, and I'll go through. We used some unique methodology. And basically what we call this is our meat consumer labeling study. But before we get into that, I want to introduce a term, because that's really what labeling's focusing on, is it's focusing on labeling something called credence attributes. Has anyone heard the term credence attribute used before? No, a few of you? Only a couple. Okay, what are credence attributes? Credence attributes are really important from a policy perspective. There's a lot of agricultural economists working on food policy around credence attributes across the world. Credence attributes are production and process attributes in food. And the unique thing about them is that they can't be verified by the consumer when they visually inspect or even experience, meaning consume or eat or taste the food product. So to give some examples, I have a few up here. So these two things of milk, and I wasn't realizing what the room was like. I was hoping I could pass these around. But you have on my left hand, these were bought at Woolworths today, by the way, the macro line from Woolworths, organic light milk, 1 liter, organic. And then this one is just Woolworths stock standard milk. They're both light milk, and there's a few claims on here. There's the health star rating, the new health star rating. Nutrition, by the way, is a credence attribute. I could tell you that both of these were healthy, but you'd have to trust me on it, right? So, but let's take organic. If I took these milk, this one's supposedly organic according to the marketing on it, right? The labeling on it. But if I took both of these out, poured them in a glass, and gave a glass to Inga, and asked her to taste it and tell me which one's organic, would she be able to do it? Some people would say they can tell a difference between organic, but most people can't in reality, right? Some people would say organic tastes much better, particularly when it comes to fruit and vegetables. But that's what we mean by credence attributes. Guess what? There's $1 difference in these two. So this was $1 more expensive. And there's clearly a market for it because it's going up. So organic. On these products, these chicken products, I have 2 different products. This one has that same accredited free range on it. It also says things like no added hormones. And this one is the RSPCA approved chicken. Those are all credence attributes. So the only way, you have to trust Woolworths or whoever's selling that that's true, okay? So why are these attributes important? Why do we care about them? Well, one thing is because consumers are using those attributes to signal quality to them, rightly or wrongly. Some people will say organic is higher quality. They'll also say that it's safer in studies. Study after study shows that there's always a group of consumers who buy organic products because they believe them to be safer or healthier or taste better, or for reasons that might actually be correct, that they have a lower impact on the environment or they're better for the animals, okay? All of these credence claims that we talk about, free range, people have perceptions that somehow the quality is better. And in some cases, they're right about it. In some cases, it's an attitude that they might be wrong about. So these are all the different ones that we're seeing on the market. There's many more, but my slide's only so big. And I put up there, this is on the upper left-hand corner. That's the new country of origin labeling that we're going to start seeing on products. So everything from made in Australia, grown in Australia, product of Australia. I used to do, when I was still living in the United States, I did a big bunch of work on country of origin labeling, and I'm pretty cynical about this one. You could get me started on it. But all of these different things, sometimes you see them all on a product. And what do consumers know what to believe? Not all of them, but several of them. Why do we care about this as economists? So as economists, we're usually trying to provide something valuable either for the industry or for policymakers. As a behavioral economist, we're really interested in how different things happening in the market, whether it be technology or in the consumer market, new sources of information impact decision-making, impact behavior, and if there's value for them. We're interested, when the government asks us to give advice on whether or not they should have labeling policy or food policy around different things, we usually look at it from the standpoint of cost-benefit analysis, and first of all, is there a market failure? Well, what does market failure mean? This is the economist's perspective. We only think governments should intervene if A, there's a market failure, and if the costs of intervention from the government are less than the cost to society from no intervention. So that's the general economist's thought process. That's how we're trained, right? It's ingrained in our heads. So a market failure is when the private sector or the market fails to provide a socially optimal level of something. In the case of credence attributes in food, the something that we're questioning if there's a socially optimal level of is information. It's information. So in the case of food, it's credence attributes. We're questioning, is the information related to some attribute that consumers care about? Is it available to the consumer? So we know that there's mandatory nutrition labeling in Australia. There's now mandatory country of origin labeling of certain food products, particularly processed and those sold at retailers, okay? So somebody decided that consumers need access and value that information and have a right to it, okay? So is there information available? If there isn't and someone's wanting it, then the government starts to think, should they intervene? This is another important point. When consumers try to search for that or determine the reliability of the information that they want, so organic. If I pick this up and I want to try to determine which one's organic, this one, sorry, there's a label there, but if I try to determine if that organic is true or not, and I try to actually go and do the investigation, that would cost me a lot of money, right? I'm trusting that Woolworths wouldn't let anything on their shelf that wasn't organic, right? So, but I'll talk about organic in a minute. So search, we don't want the search for information that people value to be too costly, and we don't want there to be a high degree of information asymmetry simply because we don't want there to be the opportunity, which is a key word in policy, to mislead consumers. Information asymmetry means, in this standpoint, one side of the market has more information than the other, and it's really expensive for the consumer to find that out. So with regards to any production or process, the credence attributes, it's really expensive for the consumer to go back and figure out, is the producer, is the retailer telling the truth? The other issue that we're concerned about is something called free riding. So if you look at organic, when organic first started being marketing, some people were changing their production practices. They were taking on additional costs and in the hopes of getting a market premium. Their neighbors might have seen them getting a market premium and they might have said, heck, I'm gonna label this as organic too and not do anything. I'm not saying that that's happened, but I think there's some cases where it has. I think if you look at free range, there's been some big issues in the news over the last 5 years in Australia about that, right? So producers who do the right thing usually have additional costs. It's not really fair to them if then someone else, and it can also damage the value of that attribute. So if all that exists, is there a cause for the government to intervene? Because we know bureaucracy and government costs a lot of money. So we need to look at it as economists. Is more information better? Who values the information? Is it only a small group of the population, or is it a big risk? Or is it a big group of people who maybe have low income? We need to understand, why do they value it? What perceptions do they associate with claims such as organic? Country of origin, why do they value country of origin? Why do they think it's important? And then what are the costs versus the benefits of policy alternatives? And this is where economists get brought in to do a lot of these things. And we've worked on all of it. What are the welfare implications, not just in terms of costs and benefits, but distribution in the system? So if consumers benefit, at how much of a cost does that come to producers, or vice versa? And if it's coming at a cost to producers, where is the cost borne? Is it only the small producers? Does it affect the small producers worse than the big producers? We need to look at all of those issues, the distribution of the cost and the benefits. Then we also need to look at, do consumers use the information? And I had to put something in. This is from the guy, the economist who just won the Nobel Prize. He has basically showed that consumers make mistakes when they're making purchase decisions, not just on food, but on everything. They make mistakes. So traditional economists would say they're irrational when they make choices that don't match up to theory. But what Thaler and Sunstein would say, and other behavioral economists, is that they make mistakes because they might have biases, they might have heuristics, and there might be fallacies. So we're really interested as behavioral economists in trying to understand all these questions. What do they understand? What are their perceptions or misperceptions? And that's what our study is really going to look at. So I want to pick, just quickly, on two different labeling programs we have in Australia. And because I think there's points you can pick on as an economist. First one's the Australian Organic Standard. This is actually what's called a voluntary standard. So what it means is no one's forced to put it on their product, unlike country of origin labeling, where you're supposed to put the origin if you're selling certain types of products, basically most products. The other concern about this is that it's actually legal in Australia, unlike Europe and the United States. It's actually legal to sell a product as organic without having your production system certified, without being a certified organic producer or a certified organic whatever. So you can market, process, sell a product as organic and put organic on your label without having certification. And certification, by the way, does tend to cost money in terms of the record keeping and getting initially certified in particular. The other thing that I find quite interesting is in Australia there's actually two standards, again, unlike the EU and the United States. Now these two standards are quite close. In fact, most people just assume that there's one. And that's the first one, which is the oldest standard, which came about, I think, in 1992. And this is called the National Standard for Organic and Biodynamic. But interestingly, our oldest standard is for export. So if you want to export organic produce or products out of Australia, you have to be certified. But to sell in Australia, you don't have to be certified. But if someone catches you, and reports you, the ACCC can investigate you and slap a big fine on you. So the second one actually came about later, and it's actually put on importers into Australia as well as the domestic market, okay? The other thing I find interesting here, I did a lot of work on this in the United States, is that there's 6 approved certification bodies. That's not the problem. But what can be concerning and what we're starting to see come up in some of our consumer research is consumers are getting bloody confused, okay? Because a couple of those you see very frequently on labels. And so you hear consumers say, I don't know the difference. I don't know who to trust. What is the Australian, or what's the difference between them? Actually, most of them are really, really close, but it's confusing for the consumer, okay? It's confusing. So if I was a producer of organic, we're seeing massive investment, and we know it costs farmers extra. I'd want to be getting on top of this, because if I'm making that investment to do the right thing, and we're seeing quite a bit of investment. In fact, Australia has the largest share of organic land in the world, in the globe, 53%, and that's clearly going up. That's 2002 to 2016 estimates, okay? And the other thing, this isn't our research, but I could put it in because it validates my point, and it's a decent survey done by a reputable company for the Australian organic industry. They asked consumers who buy organic or who don't buy organic, why don't you buy it or why don't you buy more? And we see 43% of those people say lack of trust in the organic claim. So clearly there's a trust issue. They have 14, which is the kind of greeny yellow color, and 2016 figures. There's not a lot of difference. It's both 43% both years. So at least that's not increasing over 2 years, but it's still a decent share. The other reasons, 27 to 23% of people, and there's some slight increase but not dramatic, say that they lack reliable information that organic is better for the environment, that organic is healthier, that animals are treated better on organic farms, and that no GMOs are used. So there's getting to be cynicism. I can't find any figures before that. They may have them, but it's just showing you that it's there. So there's getting to be cynicism, and I reckon it's partially to do from consumers seeing all these different labels and that lack, the ability to sell product into the market in Australia that might not be certified. So the other one I want to pick on a little bit is free range. So I don't know if many of you knew this, but as of this year, we now have a standard in Australia. And the biggest point of controversy here was, probably the biggest one, was the stocking density, okay? So CSIRO and global standards are basically that you should be allowed to have 1,500 hens or less. That's considered to be good practice. The Australian standard allows 10,000 hens or less. They allow that. But I looked up, this is provided by Choice, and it's quite interesting. There on the right is all the different ones. These are just South Australian products sold in South Australia, free-range products, eggs actually. And you can see the wide variation of stocking density. I didn't name and shame here, but on the right-hand side, quite a few. But if you look, this is price. So I'm putting showing stocking density on the horizontal axis and price. So as stocking density goes up, potentially suggesting welfare of the animals go down. That's what might be shown. Here's the internationally accepted code of practice or model code of practice, 1,500. We don't see the price drop. But probably there might be other attributes that are being marketed there. But quite interestingly, right around the 5,000, right in the middle is actually where the highest priced product is. Some of that might have to do with trust in those brands, and I reckon it does if you knew the brands associated those. You can go in and look at that. It's just Consumer Choice website. So another concern of us as economists is that consumers tend to make choices, tend to be wearing two hats. Not everybody. Some are clearly focused on their private values, but some are also focused on what we call citizen or public values. Okay? And I like to think I do this sometimes. I certainly know when I recycle I'm doing it because I'm trying to make sure that my daughter has a good environment to live in, and I try to make some consumption decisions such as cars and some food decisions that are what I think might be environmentally friendly. So we're here and we're trying to think about value for money on the right-hand side, our private values, the benefits, is it safe, is it nutritious, is it going to taste good, is it convenient? But then there's these other things I'm trying, and the media is telling me I should be thinking about the impact on the environment, the impact on the local economy, local farmers, animal welfare, all these things. And some attributes, like I mentioned, organic or free range, people embed values. So when we talk to consumers about why they're buying some of these products, they'll say, I buy organic because I think it's going to not only be better for me, but better for society. You know, both things. And again, it's because of misperception. So as economists, as behavioral economists giving policy advice, we want to try to provide government and industry where there might be concerns about that. There's also this issue about cognitive dissonance. So what's called an attitude-behavior gap. So when I have an attitude, for example, that I want to eat healthy, but because of something happening in my environment, I don't have time, or I have a kid with me at the grocery store pulling on me, wanting to go home, I might make decisions that are less healthy. And that causes stress to some people. And that's called cognitive dissonance, when we get stressed about our attitude versus our behavior, what we want to do versus what we do. And it's a big issue in environmental behavior. So there's this information age, increasing number of labels and claims, and a big issue with information asymmetry. So what's the role of industry? Is there information overload? Do consumers understand claims? And I'm finally now going to talk about that. So I'm probably going to jump through a few of these slides. What I'll say is we did this study of 1,009 consumers in 2015. It's a massive amount of data. And we did something called a discrete choice experiment. And in those experiments, we try to, you want to get a large number of consumers, so we do it using online panels. And we try to present to consumers realistic shopping scenarios where they make choices. And there's a lot of statistics involved, and Gregg, who I mentioned before, helped us design this one. And so in this case, we presented consumers with a scenario where it says, imagine you're shopping for a fresh, in this case, lamb product or whatever meat product they consume most frequently, and consumed at home. Which option would you choose? And we had a range of different products on here, beef, chicken, pork, and lamb, and they'd only be assigned to one of those meat products, again, based on what they bought most frequently. And then we have a set of credence claims in there. Everything from free range to certified organic, antibiotic-free, and no added hormones. And this is what it looks like. So they get a computer screen, they do 4 of these, and they have to make a decision. And they're presented with different types of information here, and they choose. They also have the opportunity to choose nothing, okay? They don't have to choose. So basically, I'm going to jump through some of these. I think we don't have that much time. And what I'll say is all of those attributes played a role in the shopping decision. They were important. Having the presence of different credence attributes definitely influenced decision making. But what our data would show is that consumers were really heterogeneous in terms of how it impacted them. So the most important thing, though, across all consumers was the presence of no added hormones. So no added hormones, if that was present, it had the biggest influence on choice, and it also had the highest value. We can back out values based on this, too. It's quite interesting, and we can estimate what's called willingness to pay. Interestingly, no added hormones had the highest value, but we've seen a lot of marketing around that, actually, in the last few years. But certified organic was actually only worth about half of that. But if you look at the production system, certified organic would have embedded in it no hormones, but yet the value to consumers is half in this study with respect to meat. The other interesting thing that we saw is that the values differed. The value people placed on different credence claims differed from product to product. For example, free range was most highly valued in beef and chicken, certified humane most highly valued in pork, and we see certified organic most highly valued in beef. We don't see in this study much difference between basically socio-demographics. Oftentimes people think, oh, high income are more likely to do such and such. We see weak evidence of that, and only with respect to one claim. So basically what we did, the socio-demographics, so age, gender, all those things that came out as being significant, where men are more likely than females, men are less likely, that makes more sense. Men are less likely than females to purchase certified humane. They tend to be more cynical about it. And basically, older people over the age of 60 are less likely than younger people under the age of 60 to select no added hormones. Again, when you do interviews, you hear that coming up, that they're more cynical about it. And higher income people are more likely to pick up or to prefer or select products with certified organic. So I think what I'll do is I'll flick ahead and do a few summary slides, because what we did next is we went through and did some segmentation. And you look at the data, and we have statistical programming that goes through and looks at their choice behavior, okay? And there is science behind this. And it tries to segment people. Largely what we found is that there's 3 segments or classes of people. One segment that was really heavily driven, and it was 24% of our sample, which was representative of meat consumers, meat purchasers. 24% was their choice was driven massively by the presence of those credence attributes. And largely organic and actually no added hormones. Those were the big ones. The other segment, which was 32%, was largely driven by cut. Cut was the most important thing. And then some of the credence attributes came in as being important. Class 3 was price-driven, and this is 44%. So if we look at those people, credence attributes matter, but price is really what's impacting their decision. So I think I'll skip here to some summaries, because I want to show you one bit. If we look at why, we tried to then understand why they might be preferring those products. And it really has to do with those people that the credence attributes really influenced their purchasing decision, it was because they had a lot of associations with those claims. But they also tended to be more educated, and particularly about animal welfare. But they weren't, as we expected, more likely to be rural. They were actually more likely to be urban. So they're people that tend to be probably educating themselves. But that's only 24% of our sample. The other people were kind of confused, okay? Kind of confused. So I think what I'll do, I want to show you one little bit that emphasizes this, and then go to some summary slides. So what we found is that when we look at these consumers, there's just a lot of...
So straight away I was tending towards the type that over the rest of it, and the next indicator is price. I'm not going to pay, I will get the rest of it as pay double or whatever. But then once I sort of worked out roughly what the price was sitting, I just sort of quickly scanned these, and to be honest, I just looked at it from an attribute. It's sort of, I just call them niceties. Chickens treated humanely, there's a free range seeding, or organic or something. So I was literally just going, which one's still got the most of those?
Okay.
So when we had a look at your example, all those sort of and stored in there.
So basically what this person was saying, so these are people, after we did this study, we actually brought and did a separate study earlier this year where we've just started with doing 11 people. And we're using something called eye tracking now, where people come into a room and they're actually sitting down in front of a computer screen and going through those same experiments. And we can actually track what they're paying attention to. And why we're doing that is to see, are people using this information? So it's to giving more insight. And what we find out is that you can really pick up, even in those 11 people that we've done the eye tracking with, those 3 segments. So this guy, I think he was in his late 40s, and he said, and Lenka did this interview, he was actually suggesting that he's probably focused on price and cut. So he would probably fit in that cut segment. And after he thinks about cut and price, then he might think about those other attributes, but really they're just niceties. So this is an example of the eye tracking where you can see some of the things that he's focusing on. Whoops, going the wrong way. But I want to show you the other lady, or the other person, and this just happens to be a lady. See if I can pull up one of, this one.
You can see that this one, the more expensive one, it has a lot more of those claims on it.
It does.
So does that impact your...
No, it doesn't. I'm really cynical about the claims that they make. You know, me half the time I'm not really sure hazard, but they are in fact. So we just choose with price and stuff, because that's the thing for us. We've got one baby and another baby in the lane. So it's more about cost effectiveness in our family.
But she comes back to say, and I think it's in this one, whoops, technology. Basically, she comes back to say that she's becoming really cynical about these. So, yep, if there's more of them, she'll buy it if the price is the same. But she doesn't know what they mean. She's becoming really cynical. So, again, these are some of the different methods that we're using to look at things. But I want to just kind of end, since we're running out of time, with some key messages. There's obviously a lot there. I'd hope to show you some of the eye tracking things so you can see some of this research, so that we're trying to give policy advice not just based on attitudes. So there's been a lot of work done on attitudes, but basically attitudes do not really signal the decision-making behavior. And we're getting able to do to look deeper at decision-making and understand what's influencing choices and give better policy advice through some of these new methods like eye tracking and discrete choice experiments, which you can do and actually get large samples. So what we're finding is that, yep, not surprisingly, credence claims have a positive impact on choice overall. But if you actually look at what the influence is on the decision-making, we really have segmentation. We have some people that will put the money where their mouth is, and that's about 24%, and we've seen that in other studies as well. About 44% are really motivated by price, and those attributes are just niceties. And then we have kind of another third that cut's important, and then the Credence attributes come into play, but other attributes like convenience or like the flavor, the personal attributes might come into play. So a set of factors are really influencing consumers' choices for meat. They make trade-offs, not surprisingly. I think that's something that we all know, but positive perceptions don't equal demand. So some key messages I'd really like you to walk away from. Information asymmetry is a really big concern. So those of you that might be involved in the industry in the production side or the processing side, information asymmetry concerns me. If you're trying to maintain value in something you're doing and it's around one of these credence attributes, I'd want to maybe get involved in terms of policy and think about what you can do. Labeling isn't necessarily the solution. There's other solutions. There's big misperceptions about claim. I had a graph in there and I think this was used in the media, that if you look at what consumers associate with claims such as organic or free range, they actually, between 30 and 40% of consumers actually perceive organic to be safer and to be healthier. Now, I don't think in Australia there's been any big food safety outbreaks associated with organic, and I'm certainly not trying to say anything against organic. I buy organic for some different reasons. But some of the biggest food safety outbreaks in the world have been tied into organics, okay? So it's not necessarily safer. So they also think it's better for the environment. There's some evidence to suggest that, but they do generally have some sort of level to guarantee improved animal welfare. So it's really important as consumers that you get in and do the investigation. If you're trying to be a good citizen, get in. Most of those claims, you should be able to find information on the website, and we need to understand it. So credibility is crucial to maintain any value. Consumers are becoming concerned about the benefits of, about the benefits of the food claim. I think from what we've seen in our research, working here on it for 10 years, we're seeing increasing cynicism and an increasing lack of trust. Standards, I think, need to be revisited, and we need to look at how those programs are set up. Whether they're private or public, well, we need to do more work on that. And we also, because we're such a big trading nation when it comes to food, we also need to look at how those standards are harmonized or fit in, because you don't want a producer to not be able to sell in one market if they're looking to export. So you should be able to sell in both with the same standard, okay? So that's what we think. So I'll end there and take any questions.
For a very insightful presentation. We do have a short amount of time for questions. We've got roving microphones and we've got a couple of hands up here. The gentleman in the blue jumper, Kate's just got the microphone there.
My name is Richard Table. Can you tell me what percentage of beef producers in Australia use hormones and/or antibiotics in the production? I mainly studied with chicken, poultry, sheep and beef.
Oh, that's a good question. I can't actually tell you the percentages, but most farmers, unless they're marketing into an organic program, if an animal gets sick, they're obliged to take care of it and give it antibiotics. The percentage of hormones in Australia compared to the United States would be relatively low. So hormones, it used to be that almost every beef producer in the United States was using hormones, although that's coming down over time because there's market opportunities. In Australia, it's actually much smaller. I actually don't know the number.
My understanding in Australia that no farmers use beef in the last 10, 15, maybe 20 years. They either use antibiotics or hormones, and I get that information from the Pig and Poultry Institute at Roseworthy and other places like that, and also from farm friends.
So it's different. So beef production, there is some use of hormones. You're correct in saying that it's not used in most other sectors. I think it's illegal in poultry.
The thing is that individual animals are treated with antibiotics, but not added to the feed.
Correct, generally speaking, yes.
Apparently, you have to consider antibiotic treatment or hormone treatment where you add it to all your animals and not just individual animals, because that's an animal welfare issue.
Yep. And so that's a really good point. So if we look at those claims that are being used on products, it almost leads consumers to believe that it's standard practice to use hormones. And that is potentially misleading information. If we're putting it on there and it's not general practice, then it can lead, and that has been an industry concern. So I think that's maybe the point you're trying to make. Yep.
One of the major furphies in the food business.
I'd have to agree with you that it's an issue.
Okay. We've just got one question down here.
Wendy, thank you for a wonderful, interesting survey of individuals or consumers. Oh, it's not working?
Sorry. Maybe I'll just repeat what the question is after you ask it.
Well, I guess the information that you handed out about the Nobel Prize is always a wonderful sort of reality check, isn't it? And it's interesting that recently Nobel Prize for Economics have always gone to behavioural psychologists. So were these two economists or psychologists? Because these Nobel Prizes have been handed out for years to, again, inform us that we're not very good at making choices, informed choices. So the biases and our cognitive dissonance and our particular choice at a particular time is what influences us a lot. When watching the red final, I see the advertisement for KFC. You can get, you go, I was trying to advise the Committee on Obesity in Childhood, and I understand maybe they said, well, no, carbohydrate lollies in supermarkets. But you try that influence policy here? No. But you watch those sorts of advertisements, and you can get, a hamburger, a chip, a bowl of chips, and a Coke for $5. And we spend $5 on a cup of coffee. Price.
So you're saying price is the important, and that potentially we should raise the price. I actually think price matters to some people, but to other people, when it comes to food, price is not going to change behavior. And it's what we'd say is that with respect to a lot of food products, and it's been shown in the obesity literature, that the elasticity or the responsiveness to price increases is really inelastic. It means we're not responsive to price. So changing the price dramatically of foods that would be considered unhealthy or bad is not going to have a dramatic change on behavior, most likely. It's the tax argument, but you can raise revenue through taxes. Yep, so basically the question is, are people buying organics because they perceive safety to be not necessarily maybe bacteria contamination, but it's actually associated with use of pesticides, and maybe having less pesticide residue? So, yep, I think that is a big driver of probably not just your reason to purchase organics, but others. But I think it's a valid concern. But there's been quite a bit of research to show that if production practices are followed, you shouldn't have residues in the food, right? I'm just speaking purely on what the scientific studies have shown. And the big meta-analysis looking at organics have shown that there's not really conclusive evidence to show that organic is better from a no pesticide residue standpoint. It's certainly free of GMOs. Although there's limits that are allowed in organic too, if you read the fine print. So yeah, I think it's a valid reason, but the science doesn't quite give us confidence in it, I guess.
I think we'll have to take that as our last question. Please join me again in thanking Professor Wendy.